anything that's near the border is going to be heavily laden with ICE and CBP. And we know that the amount of money and resources to the tune of over $65 billion is going to go to hiring new ICE agents. They plan to hire 10,000 new ones. They want to fill another 100,000 detention beds. So this is all about how many people can they scoop up and put in detention. So anyways, let me give you a little bit of background of who I am. I have been an immigration lawyer since 2000. Went into immigration law because I wanted to help people try to navigate a very draconian system. I remember when I first got into immigration law, people would constantly say, what's an immigration lawyer? Like, I would have to try to explain what an immigration lawyer does because they were like, why would anyone need an immigration lawyer? And then as time wore on, a lot of those people would contact me and say, now I know why I need an immigration lawyer because I married somebody who's a foreign national. I'm trying to hire someone who's a foreign national. I don't know how to navigate this system because it's been created in such a difficult and complex way that most people, even people with PhDs, can't seem to figure it out. What does an immigration lawyer do and how do you get paid? And I was like, that's a good question because we do a fair amount of pro bono work. Most immigration lawyers end up doing that because it's important to do. I think lawyers in general should be doing that, but it's especially important in immigration practice to be able to carve out some of your time for pro bono or what we call low bono assistance. I did not expect that I would be doing know your rights presentations, but in the last 7 to 8 months, I've done probably about 8 or 9 know your rights presentations for different groups. And one of the most important things is just to let everyone know what sort of precautionary measures people should take, and you should spread this information to other people because, as we all know, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to your rights. And we all have these rights no matter whether we're US citizens, we have green cards, even people who are here with no documents still have those certain inalienable rights that include your right to protect yourself from unlawful searches and seizures. So, on that note, rights during and after an ICE raid. Okay, I'm going to talk about this in the context of businesses and also if ICE comes to a person's home, and then what happens if ICE approaches somebody on a street. And this goes for any law enforcement agency, but right now ICE is the biggest concern because they are not very recognizable. We don't know who ICE agents are. We don't know if they're ICE agents or if they're just vigilantes pretending to be, or Proud Boys, exactly, pretending to be ICE agents. And that is, I think, one of the worst aspects to what's happening right now is that not only does it diminish trust with law enforcement, but it also allows people who want to commit crimes to do so under the guise that they are law enforcement. It's completely insane. And the reason for that is we've seen ICE agents going around with masks on, not wearing any sort of identifying documents on their, any sort of logos or badges on their uniforms, basically dressed like me but with a flannel shirt and a mask. And so I think one of the things that's really critical is if somebody is trying to pretend, or if somebody is an ICE agent and they approach somebody and they say you're going to be arrested or detained, you need to ask for credentials. That's first and foremost. That's if they are not showing a badge or any sort of credentials, they are required and obligated to show those credentials and to identify themselves. And if it's a Proud Boy who's lying, that person could be subject to criminal prosecution for doing that. So the rules pertaining to anywhere within 100 miles of the border, which goes all the way around the United States, that would include like borders with the ocean as well. But the 100 miles generally allow for a little less, I guess you would say, restrictions on search and seizure rules, especially with regards to cars and vehicles. Usually it's related to like checkpoints or Customs and Border Protection. They have a little more flexibility as to who they can pull over and ask questions about what their immigration status is. But generally, the rules related to being in a home or a business, those are the same no matter where it is in the United States. So that's why when you're driving down Interstate 19, you've got the border checkpoint, you've got the one in Aravaca. Those, they could set those up all over in those regions. So let me just get to the PowerPoint. So the first thing is, if, let's say you own a restaurant, which is generally one of the most targeted businesses for any sort of ICE enforcement actions. And I think we're going to see a lot of restaurants get targeted by this if things continue to progress the way they are. Anything with hospitality, anything in the service industry or labor-intensive type jobs and work. The first thing to know is that when you have a business, any public-facing areas are fair game for ICE officials to walk into. They can walk in there just like any other customer. They can walk in and they can serve the manager or the owner or whoever's designated at the business with a notice of inspection, NOI. And the sub-agency within ICE that does these investigations, it's HSI, Homeland Security Investigations. So they can enter the public areas. And that would include, if you're in a restaurant, the dining area, the main entrance, anywhere where there isn't like an expectation of privacy. So they're allowed to come in, but they can't stop and question or just arrest anyone. They have to have a warrant, a reason for why they're there, and they have to provide that. And like in the case of an investigation, it's not going to be like a warrant per se, but it's going to be a document that is filled out that is basically telling the employer, we have suspicion that you have committed certain violations of your record keeping or that we suspect you've hired people who are undocumented or have not filled out their I-9s, which are the forms that are filled out when a person applies for a job. And so they could very well serve that on an individual for the business. The private areas would be, for example, the kitchen or an office or any area, again, that there's not an expectation that a person, a customer, could just walk into. I've told people who have businesses, set up really good signs that say private or only permitted for employees or whatever, just to distinguish what is public versus private. And that is really important, even if it's just on a piece of paper that they typed up and put up with tape or something. At least you're distinguishing what is public versus private. Some restaurants have kitchens that are open. A lot of them do now. But still, you can't just walk back into that area. So they do not have a right to go back into those areas. But it's especially important to mark what is private versus what is public. And I say that on the PowerPoint. What I've told employers, and I think it's important to do in any business, is to have a protocol in place in case ICE shows up to a business. Meaning, number one, whoever is managing the establishment at that time, they should be the point person for any sort of conversation with an agent, with law enforcement. And then number two, they should accept whatever, if they get documents or some sort of notice saying that they're under investigation, they should accept that. But they also should immediately contact legal counsel. There's not a lot of lawyers that do these I-9 sort of enforcement type cases. I found that out the hard way because I had a client come to me and they were like, we just got served with this notice of inspection. And I learned really quickly, number one, it is very difficult to win ICE enforcement cases because most of the time they've got the employer dead to rights. When they come to an employer and they say, give us all your I-9s to show that you've hired these people lawfully, the employer can't just go and do edits to the I-9 and update them and try to change it or fix it. They can make minor technical changes, but they're in trouble if they have had all these allegations because it's really hard to beat ICE in these cases, and the fines are extremely excessive. It's in the case I was dealing with, it was like around $2,500 per violation, and there was about 50 violations, and it was a small business, and I tried negotiating with ICE. Again, good luck with that. They had a statutory amount that they could drop the fine by 10%. Next thing I know, it's $90-something thousand still. We tried to take it up into a court hearing. Then the court hearing had an arbitration process where we could try to negotiate. They played hardball the whole way, and then when we decided not to continue with the arbitration and just take it in front of the judge, they sent discovery and they wanted everything. They wanted all their taxes. They wanted all their documents, like financial documents. And it was a nightmare. So I'm really concerned about this happening more and more for businesses because there are a lot of businesses that have been dependent on undocumented labor. It's just nature of what our country has always been and has depended on, especially in occupations that aren't easily filled by U.S. citizens. So the moral of the story is, if you know somebody with a restaurant or businesses that might have these issues, they are best to go back and have like internal I-9 audits to look and make sure that their I-9s are in good order. And also maybe consider E-Verify, although E-Verify has other pros and cons. The private area, to go into a private area, they need a judicial warrant that has been signed by a judge, and it has to say what court it's coming from. They cannot go into a private area of a business or a home with just a DHS warrant. DHS, Department of Homeland Security warrants, are different. They look different, and they do not allow the ICE agents to go into a person's home or into a private area of a business. And I'll show you an example in a couple of slides what the differences look like. So if they tried to enter a private area, the point person, whoever the main person is, can tell them, you are not permitted to enter this without a signed judicial warrant, and if they don't have it, they're not allowed to enter. Same thing we'll talk about with someone at their home. If they do have a judicial warrant, they have to show the warrant and allow the individual to look it over and read it and inspect it and make sure it's legit. Again, big concern. What's legit and what's not right now is going to be a major question going forward. We are now hearing that the U.S. government is going to start doing neighborhood checks for people applying for naturalization, for citizenship. What that means is they could send U.S. immigration officers out to people's neighborhoods to ask their neighbors, people who are applying for citizenship, naturalization, ask their neighbors about whether this person has good moral character or not, which is completely insane. I have really cool neighbors, but I've heard some nightmare stories about neighbors. And watch out, don't be talking any crap. But the reality is, I've had clients who've come to me and said, hey, I've got these really horrific neighbors and they're harassing me and giving me a hard time. What happens when an immigration officer goes down the block and starts asking some neighbor about this guy who's applying for naturalization? It's insane what's going on. So my concern is all this is going to open itself up to a lot more fraud, a lot more misrepresentation, not from immigrants, but from people who are trying to entrap them and trying to utilize and take advantage of what this government right now is doing. The administrative warrant is the warrant that I mentioned earlier that would come from the Department of Homeland Security. That is the other warrant. And you'll see that the DHS warrant will say Department of Homeland Security on the top, and they're on either the form I-200 or I-205. This kind of will give you a brief illustration of what the differences are. And the key differences are, as you'll see up on the judicial warrant, it will say district court or whatever court it comes from, and it will be signed by a judge's signature. Again, if somebody is using something made up, that is a crime, and local law enforcement should be contacted. But again, what we're creating is a situation where people are going to be fearful and have distrust of law enforcement across the board. That's one of the reasons why Tucson Police Department has never been involved, at least not in my recent memory, involved in any sort of immigration enforcement actions, because their trust and ability to have that trust with the immigrant community and with especially the Hispanic community is critical for investigations, for getting to finding out who are the worst of the worst in our community. And if people are afraid to contact even TPD, that's a problem, because it's going to create more crime that's not going to be reported, especially domestic violence victims or others being taken advantage of by unscrupulous individuals. And so the differences, as you can see, the main thing that will point out the differences are what's on top. And so like on top of the other one, that's an old school one. It says Department of Justice. Now it would say U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, warrant of removal and deportation. So those are specific just for deporting somebody, okay? And then the other thing, like I said, with a business would be just basically like a notice of investigation, and then it lays out a whole bunch of different paragraphs about what violations were committed by the employer. If there was an ICE raid, being obviously calm it's hard to tell somebody to be calm during a circumstance like that, but the last thing you want is somebody running out the back of the restaurant and then ICE chasing them down and then a whole scene arising. it's tough. How do you advise people, especially as like laypersons, where we don't even know, maybe these restaurants and these establishments have completely legit 100% work authorized individuals. People have different ways to be able to legally work in the US. Sometimes it's a work permit, which is issued by Department of Homeland Security, also known as an employment authorization document. Sometimes they have a green card. Sometimes they don't even have any document. Like, they might be a US citizen. How do you prove that you're legally documented to work if you're a US citizen?
Walk around with your passport.
Maybe, yeah, I guess you have to start doing that, but that's never been a thing. So these are things that you have to remind yourself of, is that it's not all that cut and dry. We can't assume that every restaurant has people in the back working who are undocumented. They might all be 100% legit. But the moment somebody freaks out and runs out the back door and then ICE agent sees it, then all of a sudden the suspicion rises and a potential problem could come from it.
I mean, yeah, I was curious about that too. What if, I feel like a lot of people in the service industry have priors, right? Even if they're 100% naturalized U.S. citizens, that in of itself, their fear of police would cause them to run, and then shit would panic.
So I mean, again, it comes down to instructing staff to just stay calm, and then that's all you can do. And also, the person who is the point person, they have rights to not have to answer certain questions. If they come in and they say, "Hey, I'm looking for this guy, is he here today?" They don't have any obligation to say yes or no. They don't have to answer that question. They don't even have to take that person to the individual, because it's not their obligation to do so. And they don't have to help ICE agents do any of their legwork there. So it's one of those things where you're not only protecting your own hide, but you're protecting those people, and you're doing what is right under the Constitution.
So for, I guess what you were saying before running, are there any other things that would give ICE like reasonable suspicion when they show up?
I don't think there's a whole lot of other.
They're going to look at them and see if they're brown.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's the reality. But again, that doesn't give them the ability to just go back and arrest people. Because what happens is, it's just like anything in the Fourth Amendment realm, search and seizure. There's the fruit of the poisonous tree. If they make an unlawful arrest, there is the possibility of filing what's called a motion to suppress. You can even do that in immigration court. I've done that, where you can argue that the stop was, or the arrest was unlawful because it violated the Fourth Amendment. Now, again, saying that versus what happens in reality are two different things. And getting suppression's not easy. I found out the hard way. I'll tell you a fun story because I like to tell stories. I had a client, this was around 2009. He was about 19 at the time, came here when he was about 6 months old. And I'll never forget, his mom had a passport, and he came across with her, and his little baby, newborn 6-month-old like photo was in there. And they came across with a visa, with a permit. They were here, mom kept him here, he grew up here. He was a dreamer, went to high school, graduated high school, but this predated DACA. We didn't have DACA because DACA came around June 15th, 2012. So 19 years old, is doing what a 19-year-old does, which is cruising down the road at a late hour when he probably should have been home sleeping. And he was driving up Swan by 29th, towards golf links going south. And the Border Patrol station is down at the end of Swan. So he was in the right lane. His buddy was in the left turn lane. And an unmarked CBP vehicle drove in between them. He did not realize it was a CBP vehicle. It was a white truck. And a canine started barking at him. And the canine unit's barking, and he starts barking back at the canine. Pisses off the dog. Dog's getting irritated. And he then decides to make a right turn, but he wasn't in the turning lane. He made it from the right lane, but not the one to its immediate right. Turns down the road, goes a few hundred feet, and all of a sudden the lights come on, and that officer pulls him over. The officer walks up to his vehicle, and my client takes his ID. He had a Mexican consular matricula. It's just a consular ID. That was the only ID he had. Didn't have a driver's license, and pulls it out, which immediately gives up his alienage, that he's a Mexican citizen. So the officer walks up and says, "Why were you barking at my dog?" Which immediately when I heard this story, I think that is not a lawful reason to pull somebody over. If he's pulling him over because he made an illegal right, but why does the Border Patrol even have jurisdiction over that? That's my argument. All right, so this young man is very close to going into, now he gets picked up, they put him in immigration court. He's very close to agreeing to what's called voluntary departure, which is self-deportation. And I'm like, dude, you've been here for 18 and a half years. You've never been in Mexico. Let me think of some sort of legal strategy, because there was no relief. Like, he didn't qualify for asylum. He's not married to a citizen. He doesn't have a child born. He had nothing. And so I thought, motion to suppress. Let's argue that this was an unlawful search because the officer clearly came with the frustration of him barking at his dog and not for any sort of other reason that would pertain to his immigration status. The only problem, of course, is my client gave him his Mexican ID. I go into court, I make this argument, I cross-examine the Border Patrol agent. I was thinking of all these great puns that I was going to throw out. You were barking up the wrong tree that day. Or my client was having a rough night. I was having way too much fun thinking about these like different dog metaphors. I put up a good fight. The judge denied it. Now, this goes to show that if you have some creative lawyering, sometimes good things will happen. And this is what we have to do with immigration a lot of times, because we don't have a lot of times a leg to stand on. So we got to try to do what we can for our clients within the law, the parameters of the law. So we lose. So now he gets an order of deportation. So I appealed it to the Board of Immigration Appeals. Goes up to the next level. We lose at the Board of Immigration Appeals. I take it to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And then DACA comes around. And I'm like, thank you, God. And we got DACA. We got his case remanded. He got terminated. He's still here today. And all it took was a little bit of creative lawyering. But the truth is, motions to suppress can work sometimes. That's important. Another thing to keep in mind, space is really important when you're dealing with law enforcement, with any law enforcement agency. And if you want to record what's happening, you need to be, I think the rule is about 8 feet away at least. Don't come any closer or they will accuse potentially the person of obstruction. And I highly recommend recording everything. because obviously that's a great equalizer in these days, especially when we're worried about abuses by law enforcement. But I always tell people, record, but keep your distance. You can zoom in or whatever. Yes.
What if the ICE agent says to you, stop recording, orders you to stop?
You tell them to fuck off. No, I'm just kidding. Don't say that. Do not tell the ICE agent to fuck off, but you can tell them nicely, I have the right to record. And you do. The law allows for it. But the state law specifically says that you have to be at least, I think, 8 feet away. Don't use foul language with the ICE officer, unless you're me.
Don't throw any sandwiches.
Don't throw any sandwiches, although you can do that now. No, that guy got away with it. I didn't get indicted. So a repeated lesson for people is, we know this from when we were little, you have a right to remain silent. You can ask for a lawyer. That goes for immigrants as well. They have those same rights. They don't have to give any ID or paperwork. The only thing that has to be provided is a name. That's it. The other thing that's important, and I say this over and over again to people, if you're not a U.S. citizen, they should never claim to be a U.S. citizen to law enforcement. If they get caught claiming to be a U.S. citizen, that is a permanent bar to any sort of immigration benefit in the future. It is a harsh law. Memorializing what happened is important too. Anytime, and this would go for any time I think that anyone has contact with law enforcement, memorialize it. Make sure you document what happened in your own mind, and then if anyone else observed what happened, so that you have it all pieced together, because it's important to have that to not only contradict anything that the government says happened that didn't actually happen, but also to document any sort of abuses that might have happened. Try to get information about who those people are. What was their name? Did they have a badge number? How were they dressed? It's also important in case you have people who are masquerading as ICE agents. Yes.
Well, we're seeing a lot of things on the TV, on the streaming that I watch. They're not identifying themselves. They're pushing people away.
Yeah.
They're not telling anybody where they're taken. Nothing. It's
scary.
Yeah.
The reality is that we're living in a fascist situation right now. I mean, that it is fascism when you have law enforcement that is not allowing themselves to be detected. It is frightening, and frankly, I think all you can do is basically follow these basic steps and record and document it. And the more these stories continue to come out, I think the better, because I think that, this is my own opinion, and it was part of my argument in the publication I did about the Iceman cometh. People in other communities that think that they're safe from this, if they see more and more of this happening, maybe it'll wake them up, maybe it won't. It's sad. We have a virus that's gone around this country of people who think that they're immune to abuses, and they're going to find out soon that they're not, and that their businesses aren't.
So do these ICE agents have a legal right to be masked, or do they have the legal obligation to demask if somebody asks them?
Nobody quite knows what technically they're not supposed to be, but I don't even understand what the rules are right now. They shouldn't. They should be unmasked. But
legally declare themselves when you ask.
They are supposed to, yes. But most people are scared into submission when something like that happens. Imagine if you're surrounded by 5 masked people, and also they're going to say, go pound sand. You know what I mean? They're not going to. Hold on one sec, Sharon.
I'm just curious if you think that it makes sense if you have I'm actually more interested in non-workplace, but
Yeah.
if say you have someone who has a legal right to be here either because they have a green card or they are a refugee and they're in status, that they, even though they're only required to provide their name, that they immediately provide information about their legal status
If
here.
they're legal, then they should provide that. The reason why is it's the path of least resistance, obviously. You don't want to create a situation where all of a sudden they question it, they put you in the back of their vehicle, they take you to Eloy, it becomes a big to-do. Better to just provide those documents. And in fact, it is advised in the law that they carry evidence with them at all times. Also, if they've been here, this is the other thing, it gets a little bit dicey, but if they've been here without legal documents and it's 2 years or more that they've been here, they should have evidence of that, and they should keep it maybe in their vehicle or on their person, evidence of any sort of bills or taxes or whatever, because if they don't have proof of it and they don't have proof that they're in legal status, they are subject to expedited removal. And that is bad, obviously. Expedited removal doesn't sound good. Expedited deportation is what it is, and it can be conducted by an administrative officer. So the basic tips for somebody in those situations are if they have legal status, whether it be a green card or a work permit, an EAD, which is usually the proof for like DACA, or maybe if somebody had temporary protected status, TPS, or even asylum pending, they should have that on them. If they have a driver's license, that as well. Just keep those. It stinks because you don't want them taken everywhere and then losing them, or there's a greater chance to get lost or stolen. But now we're in a time where they must have those. Yeah.
I have a group that was discussing this, and our right-wing police officer said, with regard to the mask, and I was going to ask it, said, oh, any law enforcement officer has the right to be masked to protect himself and his family. And
I just don't think there's anything in the law that says, I haven't done a deep dive on that issue, but it doesn't seem right. I don't think there's anything that says, I wonder if there is anything. I'll have to look it up, whether there's like specific guidelines or rules that you would think there's like a protocol that they have to follow, but maybe it was just never addressed before.
well, the way I look at it is, I don't care if you're masked, but if you identify yourself as state police or ICE or whatever, you better show me identification.
Yeah, but how do you know the ID's legit?
Yeah.
That's the other problem. We have created a situation that's so toxic just by allowing this to happen.
Sorry, a slightly different question. Would it be legal for a neighborhood to do a neighborhood ice watch?
It's legal. You can definitely do that where you just have people looking out for their neighbors and for the community. There's nothing wrong with that. It's called protecting your friends and family and neighbors from... It's sad to say, but ICE has now become the criminals in a sense, in that we are now, the people are living in fear of
The Gestapo.
them, yes.
So, follow-up question on that. If somebody knocks on my door, wears a mask, refuses to identify themselves, but they're standing outside my house, do I have the right as owner of the house to defend myself by shooting at them?
I like
That's
that.
gonna happen. It's gonna happen.
That's what we're trending to. Now, here's the thing. There
We need them.
There is a stand your ground law, but here's the thing. You have to be under a threat, okay? So the thing is, it becomes a very subjective issue. if the person's outside your door and they're wearing a mask,
And it's 3 o'clock in the morning.
all right, so you've got to consider all the factors involved. I am not going to say the first thing you should do is pull out a shotgun and blow that person to pieces. I would say first thing might be to call 911 and get the local law enforcement over there to figure out what the hell's going on. Because the reality is, ICE probably would not be out doing that at 3 a.m. I'm not saying that,
100%, yeah.
not 100%, but most of them are going to be sleeping, and they are lazy.
Well, what about if they're just starting,
But,
okay,
yeah.
it's noon and they're busting down your door?
Yeah.
The truth is that it's all subjective. Circumstances arise, but you have to be smart to the situation. If you're truly feeling that you're in fear of some sort of person that might harm you, and they break into the house, then you probably have a better argument for your defense, because you're going to ultimately have to defend what you have done, most likely either to law enforcement or to a prosecutor in a court of law, to prove that it was self-defense. You don't want to end up like that guy up in I think it was like New York State, where the girl made the wrong turn down the road and he went and shot her. And yeah, you don't want to be that guy. But the reality is, if they show up at a house, and we'll talk about that in a minute or two, they have certain requirements as well that are very similar to what we were just talking about regarding the business with what they have to provide. Yeah, don't shoot first, ask questions after. That's probably not a good strategy. But if it's 3 a.m. and some menacing person's out in front of the house, call the cops. And yeah, maybe call a neighbor or something. Be like, hey, there's somebody outside my door. That would be not good. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about ICE or even law enforcement, police coming to someone's home. So this is a situation where a lot of people will open the door and not think about what they should do in a precaution first and foremost. And I think a lot of people now with like Ring cameras are a little more adept to not going and just opening the door for anybody. But the reality is, if law enforcement shows at the door, they are supposed to identify themselves, and they must have a judicial warrant to be able to enter the premises. And the judicial warrant must state the purpose and who they are coming to question or what their reason is. If somebody is at answering the door, they have to say, we are not going to admit you without seeing a judicial warrant. And so they either have to show the warrant through a window or maybe a space under the door, but the person inside the home should not open the door for them. Because the moment you open that door, you're opening Pandora's box.
So a lot of people have a security door, so you can open the interior door and still have the security door locked, but are they going to say, you open the interior door?
That is an interesting one. I haven't had that question come up. My initial gut reaction is both doors serve as the doors that they're not, you'd have to open both doors for them.
That makes
Yeah,
sense.
but the reality is that if you open up one door and there's another one in front, they still can't come in, and the door should remain locked. And the argument is that is both doors serve as doorways to the home. Yes, Don?
I know,
And then I'll-
probably a silly question, but do they just roll in sometimes? They just.
I'm sure they do. I'm sure they have. I'm sure we'll see stories coming out about them doing that as they hire more and more unqualified officers who are 18 years old with no real true understanding of what, I mean, the training's going to be bad. It's a bad situation that's coming, you know. We're hitting really bad times. By the way, I will tell you one other thing. I want to give you guys some practical tips from my own experience. If you get pulled over, don't do what Justine Wadsack did. And I know, because listen to it, here's what happens. You get pulled over, and she says, I am State Senator Justine Wadsack, all right, or something like she said that. Do you know who I am? That's the first thing she did. All right, that's your first mistake. You're already trying to show up the officer. The second mistake is that she then tried to keep fighting and fighting, even though she got nailed going 70 and 45 or 35 or something. Here's what you should do. A few weeks ago, I did a campaign event on the other side of Tucson in Oro Valley. So don't be Justine Wadsack, be me. Be Bo Goldman. Just fall on your sword. All right, that's unsolicited advice. It's fun to just rag on Justine, you know. Hopefully she shows up in court someday. Actually, shouldn't they be like arresting her by now? She's got a contempt warrant going, doesn't she? God, she's a piece of work. So anyways, again, if they show up with an administrative warrant to someone's home, that is not sufficient to be admitted into the home. So anyone who is an immigrant that you know that needs to know this information, please share that info to them. It's really important that they understand what their rights are. Because while it's important for U.S. citizens to be aware of it, it's even more important for immigrants and people who are the most marginalized in our population. So again, gets a little redundant. Ask for a badge or identification through the window or people. Ask if they have a warrant signed by a judge and ask them to provide that to show you it. And never lie or produce any false documents and never sign anything. That's always been a problem, especially with the immigrant population, that can be easily taken advantage of. And I've seen time and again where law enforcement will misrepresent what they're signing, and they sign their, I wouldn't call it a death warrant, but basically their self-deportation. It has happened over and over again with Border Patrol over the years, to the point where the abuses, and we've documented them, are just innumerable. It's really bad. And that, of course, is due to the fact that there's a lot of human trafficking and we don't have good legal pathways for people to come here, so they go through desert. Anyways, back to the presentation. It was asked earlier about what happens if they force their way in. If they do, I don't recommend pulling out a shotgun and shooting or anything, but it's better to just assert your rights, that you don't consent to entry. Again, if there's more than one person in the home, somebody should record it, or the person themselves can try recording it by saying, I do not consent to your entry or your search of these premises. I'm going to exercise my right to remain silent, and I want to speak to a lawyer. Those are things that just have to be drilled into everyone's head right now. There are those red cards that get handed out a lot to the immigrant population. Could go for U.S. citizens as well. Those red cards, they get printed up, published by primarily the ACLU and some of the other human rights or immigrant rights organizations, but they list the basic rights, and they basically just lay out the basic rights so that people know what they are, so that if they are in a situation with law enforcement, they know what to say, and they have it on their body. If you're traveling now and you're going international and you have a phone, and let's say you've said a few choice words about our president on there, or you've made comments about what's going on in the Middle East that might be contrary to what our administration thinks is American or in lockstep with their beliefs on what's going on there. The tips from the ACLU to prepare for your trip: travel with as little data and as few devices as possible. The less you're carrying, the less there is to search. Consider using a travel-only smartphone or laptop that doesn't contain private or sensitive information. You could also ship your devices to yourself in advance. I asked a colleague of mine who works out in New York whether she's been getting a lot of calls, and because we have heard stories of people who've had their devices and checked out, and there have been news stories about people who've been harassed and had a hard time getting into the country. She said it's not really all that prevalent, but there are some really good tips online in case you really are concerned about your device being looked at. The other problem is when you're coming through a port of entry, any port of entry, you don't have the same rights that you would have inside the United States because you're not yet in the US. So for example, let's say you're coming across a port of entry at the Mexican border. You don't really have a whole lot of right to tell the officer not to look at your phone. You can have your phone set up in a way like where you have certain ways that they can't just open it, obviously with your secure your passcode and all that sort of stuff, but they could delay your coming into the country. Also, the fear of people having information being found out about their belief, their core belief system, and maybe not being a big fan of Trump, again, hasn't really been a huge issue for U.S. citizens, but it is a bigger problem for foreign nationals. Encrypt devices with strong and unique passwords and shut them down when crossing the border. Store sensitive data in end-to-end encrypted cloud storage account and remove any sensitive data from your device. 3 more tips. Upload sensitive photos on your camera to your password-protected laptop or a cloud storage account. Keep your devices off. And let officers know you have privileged material on your device if that is the case and you don't want to. If it does come up, don't just say, I've got privileged stuff on this. Anyways, my time is up. Do we have time for a few questions, if any?
Absolutely, yes.
All right.
I was just going to say that the Tucson Rapid Response Network is a network that has started in 2017, and they're active now. I just went to a meeting with them. They do training and they accept applications for community observers. So like when you're talking about ICE shows up at your door, there's a number that you can call, the Tucson Rapid Response Network, and they send out an encrypted alert to all of their community observers to try to encourage anybody who's available to come out and observe what's going on. There's obviously not a guarantee that somebody will come to your place of employment or your home, but it's certainly possible, and the more people that are trained and signed up as community observers, the point of that, from my understanding, was number 1, to observe what's going on and document that, and then also to potentially be of assistance to individuals who maybe get detained. But what they were talking about is that right now they don't have enough data to be able to project where enforcement action is going to be taking place, and so that's something that they're hoping to do. So the more community observers that they have observing what's going on and providing, they have a questionnaire that you fill out afterwards, the more information they're getting in, that they get in, they're hoping to be able to provide some kind of forward-looking information.
Also, I put up here some of the basic pointers for anyone who gets detained by ICE. There is a detainee locator. Traditionally, it's been pretty solid to be able to find out where the person's been sent or detained. I don't know if it's going to continue down that path, but that's where we generally will go, and we'll search them based off of their name and their country or date of birth. The other thing is, a lot of times they'll say they will not give out a person's alien registration number, their A number, if they get arrested and detained. And the best way to get it is through the consulate, like the Mexican consulate, the Guatemalan consulate, whatever. The consulate can access it, or the family might be able to access it through that individual. But there's often a time, like a hazy time, where you don't have access to that person because they're being transferred and you're trying to find them. And it is so hard to get DHS to give out that A number. They treat it like it's a social security number.
It's felt pretty grim in terms of like the sentiment being so hostile last year, and with Trump winning, Prop 314 winning, the asylum system being gutted, the Lake and Riley bill passing very easily. It feels we got all these abuses going on now. How do we go and convince people to actually change their mind and to not have it just be just a reaction of saying, this is just the most extreme stuff that I didn't sign up on? Like, how do we change like the overall sentiment to not be so hostile to immigrants?
I think it's a slow process. It's going to take some time. Unfortunately, the majority of people who supported this initially, the idea was more go after them, not me or my people. The more it starts to occur to people who were thinking it wouldn't impact them, the more it's going to change public sentiment. I think the more you see people realizing that it's going to devastate their communities, their businesses, economically in the pocketbook, that's where things start to shift. That's always been the way I looked at this. I think there'll be a whiplash effect. It is all about, at the end of the day, the money, like you're saying. Are your cost of goods, produce going up? Farmers not able to have the people working on their farms? People doing roofing, construction, stuff like that. It's gonna happen, and it's gonna happen, but it might not be for a year or 2 years. Like at some point, I think the scales start to tip a bit. But we already have seen that a lot of the public sentiment has shifted on immigration as far as polling goes. So maybe heading into the midterms, there's going to be a lot of changeover on that issue. The problem is that this administration, they don't care. They really don't care, because you got people in there like Stephen Miller, who's just going to continue going down the pathway of destruction versus saying, oh, public sentiment doesn't agree with what I believe in. Let them burn. The way I see it is, let this administration crash and burn, and then unfortunately we're going to have a lot of collateral damage because of it, but hopefully the aftermath of it 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road is better for everybody. That's the hope, is that they crash.
Badly.
Really bad.
To death.